The Francafrique has been featured prominently in many recent headlines, the result of coups in both Niger and in Gabon. In light of these events, we felt it was high time to start looking at the role and changing position of French-speaking Africa during the Cold War. Unlike many of the wars of decolonization that took place in the British and Portuguese African colonies, however, violence was not always a mainstay in French Africa, as Paris moved to try and retain its power, or at least its influence, in the region. I'm your host David, and this week we are taking a look at the variety of different approaches that France pursued in sub-Saharan Africa in the post-war period. This is the Cold War. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union held sway over much of global politics. This came largely at the expense of the older great powers of Western Europe, Great Britain and France. Both found themselves in a struggle to retain at least some of their global influence under increasingly unfavorable circumstances. This desire to keep their empires was largely at odds with the emerging anti-colonial movements which aimed to challenge foreign European rule. For France, this struggle is epitomized by armed conflicts, including the ones in Indochina and Algeria. By contrast, though, the transition of sub-Saharan Africa from colonialism to independence is often considered to be smooth and peaceful. While not entirely wrong, this notion tends to ignore the multiple conflicts that did emerge in the colonies, leading to violence and tens of thousands of casualties. Okay, so of all the European nations that colonized Africa in the late 19th century, France was one of the most energetic, and judging by the size of its colonial domain, the most successful as well. Alongside Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, its empire included two federations, French West Africa, AOF, and French Equatorial Africa, AEF, as well as larger parts of a few former German colonies, including Togo and Cameroon. France also had a number of territories in the Indian Ocean, including Madagascar, Comoros, and French Somaliland, that's modern-day Djibouti. French colonialism has developed a reputation as being somewhat lax and inclusive, at least compared to other colonial nations. This is not an undeserved description either. As early as 1848, residents of 4 Senegalese communes were granted full French citizenship, including the right to elect representatives to the French Parliament. In 1914, Senegalese deputy Blé Diagne became the first black African to sit in the National Assembly. The language of liberté, égalité et fraternité is, after all, international. However, it would be wrong to present French colonial rule as benevolent and devoid of exploitation, discrimination, and racism. Residents of those 4 communes in Senegal comprised an overwhelming majority of French citizens in Black Africa. Rather than citizens, most Africans were colonial subjects. They had no political rights and were subject to forced labor, as well as indigena policy, which allowed the authorities to punish Africans without trial. The few native Africans who managed to obtain a European-style education were called évolués, or the evolved ones. The implication thus being that French culture was inherently superior to any African one. Now, the worst features of French colonialism came to a peak soon after the fall of France in 1940. Under the Vichy administration, the practice of forced labor increased dramatically and was extended to all native African men aged between 16 and 40. Acts of resistance were punished with prison sentences, hard labor, and even the death penalty. Grocery stores had separate lines for blacks and whites. Food allocation was unequal, with blacks receiving 5 times less bread, 16 times less sugar, and no butter and milk, which were exclusively reserved for whites. Any talk of the assimilation of black people into the French nation was over. The Vichy administration, not surprisingly, was openly racist and authoritarian. There was, however, an alternative. In a broadcast from London, General Charles de Gaulle urged France to continue fighting, thus giving rise to the Free French movement. In Africa, however, its success was modest, at least to begin with. De Gaulle was supported by only a single colony, the most remote of them all, and the only one having a black governor, Félix Éboué, a total Chad move. But as the war progressed, the entirety of French Africa flipped to support de Gaulle, and tens of thousands of Africans took part in the liberation of France. It was also during the Second World War that one of the turning points in the history of French Africa happened, the Brazzaville Conference, held in January of 1944 in the capital of French Equatorial Africa. In Brazzaville, Charles de Gaulle and the colonial establishment proclaimed that the colonies saved the metropole, that the colonial empire should be transformed into some sort of federation governed by a federal assembly, and that new development initiatives should be introduced in Africa to promote industry, education, and trade. Most importantly, however, de Gaulle was quite clear that he would not tolerate anti-colonialism, stating, quote, "It belongs to the French nation and only to her to proceed when the time is opportune to make reforms in the imperial structure which she, France, will decide upon in the context of her sovereignty." The principles of Brazzaville began to be implemented shortly after the war in the constitution of the new French Fourth Republic. A number of delegates at the Constituent Assembly were elected by native Africans and were there to protect African interests. For example, 1945 saw the abolition of indigénat. Under the new constitution, the French colonial empire was reorganized into the French Union, participation in which was, quote, "freely chosen" by the people of both metropole and overseas territories. Both were now citizens of the Union and had a right to be represented in the National Assembly. But this draft of the Constitution was not approved when put to a referendum, and the second draft, which did pass, dropped the freely chosen clause. It also reduced the already small number of African representatives to the Assembly and reserved half of the African seats for the citizens of France proper. Still, this was a big deal. Africans outside the four communes could now send their elected representatives to Paris. Some progress versus no progress, right? Now, when it came to the economy, French Africa experienced huge investments into public works, including ports, airports, roads, public buildings, and dams. Much of the investment was made under FIDE, a program under which funds from the metropole were used for colonial development. Apologists of French colonialism often cite FIDE activity as an argument for the benevolence of French rule. It's important to note, however, that the largest amount of funds for investment came from African taxes, and that a significant portion of the funds which did come to Africa from the metropole were actually American, a part of the Marshall Plan. Spending on education rose as well, but the language of instruction was strictly French. Textbooks commonly started with the phrase, quote, "Our ancestors, the Gauls, were tall and fair." African languages were not given an opportunity to embrace their written form, which stood in sharp contrast to the African colonies of the other European powers. Hausa was a written language in Nigeria, but not in Niger. Mandingo was written in the Gambia, but not in Senegal. And Kikongo and Lingala were written in the Belgian Congo, but not in the French Congo. Somewhat of an exception to this rule, however, was Arabic, the language of both public and private madrasas. Much of French Africa was Muslim, after all. So it was in this atmosphere that Africans increasingly looked for a source of identity. In Senegal, Léopold Senghor celebrated négritude, expressing a view that in blackness there was a special social quality. There was a boom in African literature, with prominent writers including Olympe Belly Quenoum of Dahomey, Kamara Lay of Guinea, and Mongo Bedi of Cameroon. The Mandingo epic Sundiata, a heroic story of the medieval empire of Mali, was translated into French. Historical work by Cheikh Anta Diop developed the idea that ancient Egypt was a black kingdom, and not just black, but closely related to contemporary West Africa. This is a contentious argument even today, as Netflix recently found out. The trend was then that Africans were increasingly asserting themselves. This inevitably led to conflicts against colonial rule, however, not necessarily in the way you might expect. While attempts to break from France and win independence did take place, it was more common to fight for the abolition of colonial practices and for achieving the same political and social rights which the citizens of the metropole already enjoyed. It wasn't that people wanted out, they wanted in. One of the instruments Africans used was, somewhat ironically, borrowed from France, strikes. With assistance from the General Confederation of Labor, there developed a formidable trade union movement, and many future African leaders made careers as trade unionists. Examples include Modibo Keïta of French Sudan, Djibo Bakari of Niger, and Sékou Touré of Guinea. Two of the three would become their nation's first presidents. The most famous of the strikes that took place was in 1947 and 1948 on the Dakar-Niger Railway. There were two main issues. The first was the status of auxiliary workers, who constituted a majority of people working on the railway. Many of them had been working for the railway for years and were highly skilled, yet their auxiliary status meant that they had no job security or housing and were paid less. The strike demand was to give auxiliary workers permanent jobs. The second issue was that of racial discrimination, namely the fact that Europeans received more pay for the same work. From October 1947 to March 1948, almost 18,000 railway workers went out on strike. The situation was only resolved by a new socialist governor-general, Paul Bichard. A number of compromises were proposed, namely some improvements of conditions for auxiliary workers. Several years later, Africans would gain a victory in Paris. The second Lamine-Guillet Law of 1950 would make it illegal to discriminate against workers on the grounds of race, provided they were performing the same work. In the case of the railway strike, the French strategy was essentially defensive. Colonial dissent was placated by compromises and the gradual fulfillment of African demands. This, however, was not always the case. Let's look at Ivory Coast. Unlike most French colonies, Côte d'Ivoire was profitable thanks to its coca and coffee plantations. In the 1940s, 80% of coffee and 90% of cocoa were produced by African-owned plantations, yet they were outcompeted by European-owned ones. When the crops were ready for picking, Europeans, with their access to forced labor, requisitioned the agricultural workers, often from African-owned plantations. The latter were also subject to more stringent quality controls and were paid less for their produce. To tackle this situation, African planters organized themselves into Syndicat Agricole Africain, led by Félix Houphouët-Boigny. Remember that name because it won't be the last time you hear me say it. After the Second World War, Houphouët-Boigny was elected to the Constituent Assembly as an Ivorian deputy. There, he won for Africa the abolition of forced labor in 1946, soon after the abolition of indigénat. At the same time, there was an ongoing dispute over the new French Constitution. In September 1946, African deputies published a manifesto demanding to preserve the rights and freedoms granted to Africans in the first, rejected draft of the document. The manifesto also called for an interterritorial congress to be held in Bamako, the capital of the French Sudan. But a split soon emerged. The Socialist Party believed that the Communists were behind the manifesto, and they urged its affiliates in Africa not to attend the Congress. Socialist Senegalese leaders, Lamine-Guillet and Léopold Senghor, indeed refused to attend, but the Socialists had little luck elsewhere. In Bamako, the first truly Pan-African party would be founded, Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, the RDA. In the National Assembly, it would be aligned with the Communists. In the absence of the Senegalese leaders, the Congress had chosen Houphouët-Boigny as the leader of the RDA. From this point on, the rivalry between Senegal and Ivory Coast would be a recurrent theme. French politics, however, soon took a turn to the right. The new government was bitterly opposed to the Communists and viewed the RDA as their affiliate. A socialist, Laurent Péchot, was appointed governor of Ivory Coast, the RDA stronghold, with a specific goal to break the party. In Treichville in 1949, RDA activists attempted to disrupt a meeting of a rival political party, killing one person and injuring several more. The governor responded with the imprisonment of several leading RDA members. For months, they were held in prison without trial. In protest in December, they went on a hunger strike. At Christmas, Ivorians launched a boycott of European goods, and the wives of the detainees, supported by thousands of women, organized a march on the prison in Grand-Bassam. More incidents occurred in January. The French responded harshly, and by the end of 1950, the accused received sentences of 3 to 5 years. Overall, about 50 Africans were left dead, many more wounded, and about 3,000 had been imprisoned. In this atmosphere, Houphouët-Boigny and the RDA had to reconsider their links to the Communists. On the 18th of October 1950, Houphouët-Boigny announced disaffiliation with the French Communist Party, presenting it as a change of tactics. In 1951, Ivory Coast was visited by the Minister for Overseas France, a certain François Mitterrand. He replaced the governor, opened a new port in Abidjan and gave the RDA an offer to align with his political party, the center-left Democratic and Socialist Union of the Resistance. Houphouët-Boigny agreed. So, in Ivory Coast, the French colonial regime achieved a victory. Once an opponent of colonial practices, Houphouët-Boigny was co-opted into the system and became a chief voice calling for cooperation with France. Until the end of the colonial period, and even long afterwards, Ivory Coast would remain a bastion of French influence in the region. Now, looking at Ivory Coast, we could conclude that a French victory didn't mean an African loss. After all, there's nothing wrong with cooperation if it's fair, consensual, and mutually beneficial. But in our last example, however, a victory for France definitely was a defeat for the Africans. Remember, in the beginning when I talked about tens of thousands of casualties, it's time to talk about Madagascar. Well, no, the other one. Unlike many French colonies, Madagascar had a recent history of native centralized rule, as well as a strong anti-colonial tradition. After the Second World War, Madagascar, similar to many other places in the French colonial empire, experienced the rise of a popular political party, Mouvement Démocratique de la Rénovation Malgache. It was an umbrella movement including moderates as well as radicals. The latter frequently visited villages, recruiting the locals into party ranks, and promised independence. From this, a rebel army formed, nicknamed Marasolohi, which was Malagasy for many spears. On March 29, 1947, fighting erupted simultaneously across the East Coast. The rebels attacked military garrisons, administrative centers, and native sympathizers, burning buildings and killing a number of Frenchmen. The colonial administration responded with force. A campaign of military repression included slaughtering cattle, burning towns and fields, and leaving rebels and civilians alike without food. The uprising lasted for over a year. The rebels, who had inferior weapons and were weakened by hunger, found themselves in a steady retreat. In December 1948, the French declared the rebellion over. Historians estimate that by the time it was put down, 550 Frenchmen had been killed, while 100,000 Malagasy had been executed, tortured, starved, or driven into the forest, with over 11,000 Malagasy killed as a result of direct military action. The tragedy of 1947 remains a foundational event in modern Malagasy history, and March 29 is celebrated in Madagascar as Martyrs' Day. So, in this episode, we've seen the rise of anti-colonial movements in French sub-Saharan Africa, which should come as no surprise in the global post-war period. We've seen France using different strategies to tackle those movements to restore order and French control. In the case of the Dakar-Niger Railway, it was placation. In Ivory Coast, co-optation. In Madagascar, brutal repression. Yet, as time moved forward, direct French rule in Africa would become increasingly unsustainable. Most of the French colonies would declare independence, although in many cases, they would retain strong connections to the former metropole. Look for more on this in future episodes. To make sure you don't miss those episodes and any other content we create, please make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and of course, that poor bell button. Although, if you only push one of them, the others would demand equal treatment, go on strike, and then align themselves with the Communist Party, forcing French intervention. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.